Buried inside, everything believers have pieced together about 2026 is one line with an actual date bolted to it, a single month, not a vague season. 1 month, named, and they say, it's the moment everything tips. It sits at the far end of a year they claim opens with the whole world splitting in two, east against west. A blind woman they call Baba Vanga supposedly left that shape decades ago and never wrote a word of it herself. I'll walk you up to that month before we're done, but it only lands once you know the woman it came from. So who was she? Vangelia Gushtarova, born in 1911 inches, a dusty corner of the Balkans, a completely ordinary girl until a storm, a tornado by most tellings, swept her off her feet and dropped her far from home. When they finally found her, her eyes were caked shut with dust and grit. She never saw again. But her followers say that's the exact moment the other kind of sight switched on. By the Second World War, thousands were trekking to her door, begging to know if their sons were alive or dead. She grew so famous during the war that Bulgaria's own king, Tsar Boris III, reportedly climbed the hill just to sit with her. And the stories that turned her into a legend are genuinely chilling. In the year 2000, believers say, she had warned that Kursk would be covered with water and the whole world would weep. Then a Russian submarine named Kursk sank to the bottom of the sea, and 118 men died. Coincidence, sure. But keep counting, because that one is only the first on a very long list. Then there's the one about the towers. Back in 1989, she supposedly said the American brethren would fall after being attacked by steel birds. 12 years later, 2 planes tore into the World Trade Center. Add Chernobyl, the death of Princess Diana, the rise of what some versions call a 44th president who would be black, and you start to see why people don't simply laugh this off. The paper trail is thin, the wording is slippery, but the pattern is the thing that hooks them and won't let go. Here's the strange part. Baba Vanga almost never handed out clean dates. What we now call her 2026 predictions are really decades of scattered, translated and retranslated fragments that believers have sorted, stacked, and pinned to a single calendar. And when they laid every piece out on the table, one year kept lighting up brighter than all the rest, not for one reason, but for a whole cluster of them at once. And almost every fragment, they noticed, split the world into 2 halves that were about to slam into each other. Picture the globe the way she supposedly saw it, not as countries, but as 2 great blocks, the East and the West. The single thread running through nearly every 2026 fragment is a war that begins in the East and then spreads westward, dragging the entire planet in behind it. Interpreters have since put names to those blocks. China and Russia on one side, the United States and Europe on the other. And 2026, they insist, is the hinge that the whole door swings on. Plenty of years get slapped with doom and nothing ever happens, but here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. The people tracking this don't just have a vague bad feeling, they have a specific claim that 2026 marks the beginning of the downfall of humanity. Not a rough year, not a recession, the beginning of the downfall. That exact phrase is circulating, welded to her name, and it's the reason this stopped being a fun little New Year's story and started quietly keeping people awake at night. And it doesn't stay abstract. One of the most viral fragments claims she foresaw Europe itself, the western half of that map, facing devastation so total that some versions say the continent could empty out or lose its place in the world entirely. Now, that disappearance of Europe line is the shakiest one in the whole pile. Historians can't trace it cleanly back to her at all. But it spread like wildfire anyway because it fit the exact shape people were already scanning the horizon for. Think about why a story like this catches fire in 2026 specifically. We're living through the loudest stretch of great power tension in a generation. Headlines about Russia, about the Pacific, about missiles, shipping lanes, and rare earth chokeholds. So when a dead mystic's followers announce that the East and the West are about to break against each other, it doesn't land like a fairy tale anymore. It sounds like tomorrow morning's news just delivered with a candle and a crystal instead of a satellite feed. And that's the quiet machinery underneath all prophecy. It doesn't need to be precise. It only needs to be shaped like your fears. Vanga's fragments are vague enough to fit almost anything, which is exactly the accusation skeptics throw at them. But her believers flip it right around. If the same blind woman kept describing a divided, colliding world decades before anyone drew these battle lines, maybe the vagueness isn't a bug. Maybe she was seeing the shape of it, and never the fine details. So far, it's geopolitics tense, but familiar. Wait until you hear what comes next, because this is where her 2026 stops sounding like a war forecast and starts sounding like something no analyst on Earth would ever put in a report. The map, it turns out, was not the only thing she supposedly circled that year. Stacked right on top of it were 3 more warnings, and each one, believe me, is stranger than the one before it. First, the money. A huge slice of the 2026 fragments points straight at the global economy, a cash crush, believers call it. A collapse rippling through banks, currencies, and digital payments, all seizing up at roughly the same moment. And bolted to it is one oddly specific claim: gold goes vertical. As paper wealth burns, they say she saw gold becoming the one thing left standing. Now, watch how neatly that maps onto real anxiety, because gold has already been smashing record after record, and everyone's got a theory why. Second, the machines. Several fragments credit her with warning that artificial intelligence would seize control of key sectors around this very year, not just swallowing jobs, but forcing questions nobody's quite ready to answer about who is actually running things. And look around you. We are, right now, living through the exact AI upheaval those fragments describe. Whether she genuinely saw it or whether we're just pattern matching backwards to make ourselves shiver the fit is uncomfortably tight either way. Third, the ground itself. And this is where it gets really strange. Believers say she warned that 2026 would bring massive earthquakes, violent volcanic eruptions, and extreme weather clawing across 7 to 8% of the planet's land. Just sit with that number for a second. 7 to 8% of all the land on Earth shaking, burning, or drowning inside a single year. Whether that's a real forecast or a translation blown wildly out of shape, it is a big, ugly, unforgettable claim. And here's the thing about stacking all of this together. Any single one of these war, financial collapse, AI, natural disaster is a story you've heard 100 times before. But the reason 2026 lit up so blindingly bright for these interpreters is that the fragments seem to pile all 4 onto the very same 12 months. War in the East, the money gone, the machines rising, the ground breaking open. 4 cracks, they say, all spreading at once. That is the pattern that puts a chill down the spine. You could call it cherry picking, and skeptics absolutely do pull enough vague fragments from a 50-year archive, and you can build a catastrophe for any year you like. That's a fair hit. But it doesn't quite explain why so many of these fragments seem to rhyme with headlines that are genuinely unfolding right now. Rising tension between the blocks, gold at records, AI everywhere you look. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's confirmation bias. Or maybe, and this is what her followers whisper, she circled this year for a reason. Which brings us to the strangest circle of them all, and the only one with an actual date nailed to it, because buried inside the 2026 fragments is a claim that fits no war and no market anywhere. November 2026. That month, believers say, she foresaw the moment humanity would no longer be alone. A massive craft arriving. First, contact the East and the West, finally united at last, but by looking up together instead of at each other. Sit with how odd that turn is. Every other fragment is about division East against West, block against block, the whole world tearing along one long seam. And then, right at the tail end of that very same year, a single line about the entire species meeting something from the outside together. Some believers read it as the twist ending, that the collision she saw wasn't humanity's finish line at all, but the shock that finally forces the two halves to look at each other as one. Now, the honest part, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Not one of these has a clean, authenticated source. Baba Vanga never wrote a word. She was blind and largely unlettered, and everything we have has passed through decades of memory, translation, and people who badly wanted it to mean something. Science hasn't confirmed a single line of it. Believe it, or don't believe it, that, honestly, is exactly where the trail goes cold. And yet, every year the trail goes cold, and every year millions of people walk right back to it anyway. Not because the evidence is strong, but because the shape she left behind keeps fitting the world a little too well. A blind woman in a Balkan village, dead for 30 years, and here we all are, pulling her fragments off the shelf, holding them up against the news, and quietly checking whether the East and the West are drifting toward the line she supposedly drew. So here's the exact line they point to, the one I promised you at the very start. Stripped of all the noise, the circle around 2026 comes down to this: a war that starts in the East and spreads to the West, all of it bending toward one single month, November, when everything supposedly changes. That's the whole prophecy. One divided year, one date, one blind woman who may have said none of it. So I'll leave you with the only question that actually matters. When November 2026 comes and goes, which will you be watching for, the collision or the contact? Tell me in the comments. All right, that wraps it up. Like, save, subscribe, and we'll dig deeper next time.